70 years without a top predator changes a wetland in ways that don't announce themselves loudly. No dramatic collapse, no single catastrophic moment, just a slow, quiet emptying until one January morning in 2021, a door opened on a remote island in northeastern Argentina, and everything that had been waiting began to move again. 3 jaguars. That was the opening. A mother named Maria, 3 years old, and her 2 4-month-old cubs. A wildlife guard kept his distance. A biologist held her breath. Maria stepped through the doorway, paused at the edge of the tall grass, and then disappeared into the reeds without looking back. No hesitation, no confusion, as if she already knew exactly where she was going, because in some deep biological sense she did. What happened in the 4 years that followed exceeded every projection the scientists had dared to put on paper. I'm Tom Marsh, and this is the story of how 3 jaguars walked into a capybara-dominated swamp and began reassembling something that took 1.8 million years to build. The Iberá wetlands sit in the northeastern corner of Argentina in a province called Corrientes. 13,000 square kilometers of alluvial plain, lagoon, and subtropical gallery forest. One of the most biologically important freshwater systems in the entire Western Hemisphere, home to more than 4,000 species, 350 species of birds, 60 species of reptiles, and close to 30% of all Argentine vertebrate species within its boundaries. From the air, it looks extraordinary. And for a long time, that aerial view was hiding something important. What you see from the sky is the shape of the system. What you can't see is what's missing from inside it. Now, before I go further, the full story of how these recoveries actually work, the species introductions, the breeding protocols, the ecological cascades, the cases that almost failed and what saved them, goes well beyond what any single video can hold. I've put together the Rewilding Complete Pack, which covers the patterns behind recoveries like this one in much more depth. You'll find the link in the description, or you can scan the code on your screen right now. Because what's about to happen in this story, the speed of it, the mechanisms behind it, makes a lot more sense when you understand the broader framework. And the next part of the story is where it gets genuinely unexpected. The Iberá wetland began forming approximately 1.8 million years ago, when the Paraná River, the second longest river on the continent, shifted course and left behind this vast inland sea. Every species present evolved here together, across geological time, predator and prey, seed disperser and plant, water, vegetation and fish. A system calibrated over millennia with a single animal at the top of every food chain in the wetland, the jaguar. The last confirmed jaguar sighting in the Iberá wetlands was recorded in 1953. After that, for 70 years, nothing. But the jaguars didn't simply disappear, they were removed. Between the 1930s and 1953, commercial hunting and livestock conflict eliminated the jaguar population completely. Ranchers shot them on sight, caimans were killed for their hides, giant river otters were killed for their pelts. The giant anteater vanished, collared peccaries gone, pampas deer near zero. The red and green macaw had been absent from Argentine Mesopotamia for more than a century by the time restoration efforts began. What remained was a wetland that still had its outline, still vast, still beautiful from the air but hollowed out on the inside. Without a top predator to regulate the trophic cascade, something else was happening at ground level. The capybara is the largest rodent on Earth. An adult consumes between 6 and 9 pounds of vegetation every single day. On San Alonso Island, in the heart of what would become the national park, researchers recorded 129 capybaras per square kilometer. At that density, hundreds of kilos of vegetation were disappearing daily and nothing was stopping it. Research comparing capybara grazing areas with nearby fenced exclusion plots found that without grazing pressure, plant biomass and grass height increased significantly. Birds lost their nesting cover, insects lost their shelter. The wetland, stripped of its predator, was being grazed down to the root, and for decades, nobody had a plan ambitious enough to match the scale of what had been lost. Then, unexpectedly, help came from a man who had spent his career selling outdoor clothing. Doug Tompkins was the co-founder of the North Face and later of Esprit. He made hundreds of millions of dollars in fashion and consumer goods. In the late 1980s, having watched what that world produced, he stepped away from it entirely. His wife, Christine, former CEO of Patagonia, went with him. They moved to South America. In 1997, Tompkins flew over the Iberá wetlands for the first time. He later said he wasn't impressed by what he saw there. He was stunned by what was missing. Through a trust called the Conservation Land Trust, he began buying degraded ranch land, roughly 150,000 hectares over many years. The Argentine press called it a private American kingdom. People in the region wondered whether he was trying to control the water supply or building a business empire dressed up as conservation. In the town of Colonia Carlos Pellegrini, at the edge of the wetlands, a man named Jorge Acevedo grew up knowing this land in its decline. His father had hunted caimans until there were none left. Jorge moved into cattle work. The wetlands still looked like something from the air, but the things that had made them alive were mostly gone. And he heard what everyone else heard, that the foreigners were buying up the land, that something was going to change. He was skeptical. He'd seen plans come and go. Doug Tompkins died in a kayaking accident in December 2015. Christine continued the work. Eventually, the land was donated to help create the Iberá National Park, roughly 700,000 hectares of protected habitat. The boundary was secured. The ecosystem still had its architecture intact. All that was missing was the one animal the whole system had been built around. Getting jaguars back was not as simple as finding some and releasing them. The remaining wild jaguar population in Argentina numbered around 200 animals, scattered across the Northwest and Chaco region territories. The gene pool was small and fragmented. Sourcing animals for Iberá required coordinating with institutions across South America, years of planning, and rigorous biosecurity review. In 2012, Rewilding Argentina built a breeding center on San Alonso Island, large enough that a jaguar could live inside it under conditions reasonably close to natural. The first animals arrived in 2015. They were too old, too closely related, and too far removed from wild behavior to breed effectively. The program stalled. Then, in 2019, a jaguar named Mariua arrived. She had been found as a cub in Brazil, her mother killed by poachers. A rescue center near Brasilia took her in and transferred her to Iberá when she was old enough. She adapted quickly. Within 2 years, she gave birth to 2 cubs, Karai and Pora. The protocol was strict. Minimal human contact throughout. The animals hunted live prey capybaras and wild pigs inside the enclosure. GPS collars and camera traps monitored behavior daily. Any jaguar that became too accustomed to human presence was not released, because when a predator loses its fear of people, the first thing it goes after is livestock. And that tension between the jaguar's return and the humans living alongside it was not going to be simple. But I'll come back to that. On the morning of the 6th of January, 2021, the door opened. Mariua, followed closely by her 2 cubs, walked out for the first time into the open wetland. The grass was tall, the light was low. She paused. Then she vanished into the reeds without looking back. She was not a zoo animal. She was not a conservation symbol. She was a predator returning to reclaim a landscape that had been built for her 70 years late. By the end of 2023, the population had grown from 3 to 20 wild jaguars in less than 3 years. That was not the rate anyone had projected. And here is where the story stops being just a numbers story and becomes something harder to explain and more important. In 2022, Mario, born as a cub at release, and now a young independent adult killed a 1.8-meter Yacaré caiman on his own. In his first season as an independent predator, nobody had expected him to reach that capability so quickly. Sebastián Di Martino, director of conservation at Rewilding Argentina, compared what was happening directly to the wolves of Yellowstone. When apex predators return, ecosystems don't just gain a predator, they recalibrate. And the recalibration doesn't work the way most people assume. The biggest impact isn't in how many prey animals die, it's in the fear that returns to the landscape. For nearly 70 years, capybaras had gathered in the open, grazing for hours as if nothing could stop them. The grass was short, nesting habitat was exposed. The system had compressed itself into a flattened, simplified version of what it had been. When the jaguars appeared, behavior shifted almost immediately. Capybaras moved more. They spent less time in exposed areas. They avoided locations where jaguars had been seen. Herds that had congregated openly near the waterline began behaving differently, staying closer to vegetation, grazing more dispersed, not lingering long in any one place. A study published in 2025 documented these behavioral changes in real time. Capybaras living in jaguar zones showed altered movement patterns, reduced grazing time in open areas, and tighter grouping among herd members. The fear preceded the kill. The kill didn't even need to happen. And where grazing pressure dropped, the wetland began to recover. Grass grew taller, plant biomass returned. The soft transition zones between open water and land, some of the most productive habitat in any wetland, began regenerating in areas that had been overgrazed for generations. Birds regained nesting cover. Insects found shelter again. Native seed dispersal accelerated. The total cost of the jaguar reintroduction program, from planning in 2012 to first open releases in 2021, was approximately $9 million. For $9 million, 20 wild jaguars, a self-sustaining breeding population, and the beginning of a trophic cascade that no human engineering project could have replicated. Mechanical capybara management programs, culling schemes, and fencing interventions had been attempted in various parts of Corrientes over the years, with recurring annual costs and no lasting change in vegetation recovery. The jaguars produced that change continuously. They always had, but not everyone experienced the recovery the same way. Approximately 1,800 landowners farm or raise livestock on land adjacent to the Iberá National Park. When a jaguar roams freely, it doesn't recognize property lines. A rancher who loses a calf to a jaguar has lost real income, and that tension doesn't dissolve because a conservation report exists somewhere. Jorge Acevedo knew this. In 2022, a neighbor of his, a rancher, who had worked the same land for 30 years, living south of the park, lost 3 calves in 2 months. He didn't file a formal report. He told Jorge, he told his neighbors, "They brought them back," he said. "We're the ones who pay." Rewilding Argentina responded with livestock vaccination programs and guidance on sustainable grazing practices. But the process was slow, and the gap between a wildlife management framework and a rancher who just lost livestock doesn't close with paperwork. The organization that reintroduced the jaguar is a conservation NGO, not a government agency with enforcement authority or large-scale compensation funding. The tension persisted, and then came the moment that made plain how fragile the edges of this story still are. In March 2024, a 2-year-old female jaguar, born wild in the Iberá wetlands, part of the first generation to grow up there in 70 years, was transferred to El Impenetrable National Park in the Chaco province, 600 kilometers away. The goal was to establish a second wild jaguar population in Argentina. Her name was Auca. She spent 6 months adapting to the Chaco environment in a pre-release enclosure. She was freed on the 5th of October 2024. 20 days later, her GPS collar went silent. After an extensive search, the collar was recovered from the Bermejo River. Based on evidence gathered at the scene and local testimony, investigators concluded she had been killed. Argentine authorities estimated the ecological damage at over 2.6 billion pesos. A reward was offered. Criminal charges were filed. Auca was one of the first wild-born jaguars to be transferred between national parks for conservation purposes in Argentina. She disappeared 3 weeks after her release. The restoration story is not a straight line, but Auca was a jaguar, and the broader picture kept moving. In early 2022, Corrientes suffered one of the worst wildfire seasons in its recorded history. More than 2.5 million acres burned, roughly 10% of the entire province. Inside the Iberá National Park, close to 60% of the surface was affected by fire and drought. The jaguars were tracked through it by GPS collar. The population kept growing. Wild births continued. The fire didn't stop what had already begun. In 2022, a separate female jaguar released in a different section of the park gave birth to cubs in the open wetland. The first jaguars born wild in the Iberá region in more than 70 years. They survived, and those cubs were no longer reintroduced animals. They were born here. There is a concept in restoration ecology called ecological memory. The relationships between predator and prey, between seed disperser and plant, between water and vegetation and fish, they don't need to be reconstructed from scratch. They reassemble. The instructions are still there, written into the behavior of every species that survived, into the soil structure, into the seasonal movement of water across the alluvial plain. What looks like an empty stage is in fact a stage waiting. In Colonia Carlos Pellegrini, Jorge Acevedo left cattle work in 2021 to guide wildlife observation tours. He didn't see a jaguar on his first 8 trips. On the 9th, a March morning in 2023, a female crossed the channel 40 meters from his boat. He cut the engine. For a moment he said nothing. He later said that when he was young, there was nothing in these wetlands that would bring a stranger from the outside world to look. Now he takes people from 6 continents to watch jaguars at dawn. Time magazine named Iberá one of the world's greatest places. In 2025, the United Nations World Tourism Organization recognized Colonia Carlos Pellegrini as one of its best tourism villages. A former cattle town, now building an economy around the return of the animal it once helped to destroy. A single living jaguar generates far more economic value than the few cattle it might ever take. By 2025, the wild population stood at between 35 and 40 jaguars across 3 distinct generations. Scientists estimate the park can eventually support around 90 individuals. How quickly that happens depends largely on how the conflict outside the park is managed, on whether the people who bear the costs of restoration are genuinely part of what comes next, not simply asked to absorb it. Think about what actually happened here. A wetland that had been losing pieces of itself for 70 years. A breeding program that stalled twice before it found its footing. $9 million, years of effort, no guarantee of success. And from 3 animals walking through a doorway in the early light of January 2021, 20 wild jaguars. In under 3 years, wild births in open water for the first time in living memory. A town that found a different future from the wreckage of something it helped cause. And a young female, born free in those same reeds, killed 3 weeks after being sent to begin the whole process somewhere new. Some mornings in Carlos Pellegrini, the fog sits low over the lagoon, the herons don't move, and there's nothing but the sound of water. Jorge Acevedo knows what's out there now, moving through the reeds. We didn't restore the landscape. We returned the animal that knew how, and we stepped aside. What the landscape did with that faster than anyone had modeled, more completely than anyone had promised, is the part that none of the projections fully captured. Nature, given enough space in the return of the animals that belong in it, doesn't just recover. It accelerates. But that acceleration doesn't mean the work is finished. It means the work has entered a new phase 1 that requires defending what's been gained, managing the tensions honestly, and answering with real durability the question of who bears the cost of restoration. This is happening right now in one of the most important wetland systems in the Americas. Most people have never heard of it. I want to know what surprised you most about this story. And I'd ask you something broader. Do you think we're underestimating what ecosystems can do when we stop working against them? Leave that in the comments. I read them, and the answers are usually more varied than I expect. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs a reason to believe the news isn't always going one direction. And if you want more of this real recoveries, real places, real stakes, there are more stories like this one than you'd imagine, and I have many more to tell you. Soy Tom Marsh. Thanks for watching.